Hello and welcome to today's Digital Energy Festival dialogue on the role of nuclear in the green energy future, hosted by ESI Africa and the Nuclear Industry Association of South Africa. I'm your host for today's webinar, Nicolette Pombo-Van-Zyl, editor of ESI Africa. It is my pleasure to introduce a special guest who will take a closer look at the world's green energy transition. Welcome to Michael Shellenberger, the best-selling author of Apocalypse Never. In a Twitter post, Michael, you said that your book received strong pre-publication reviews from leading scientists and scholars, but that you took the decision to write Apocalypse Never because much of what we believe today about the environment is wrong, and we desperately need to get this information right. Michael, let's start with looking at the fact that the world has experienced mass extinctions before. What role is human activity now having on mass extinction of various species that we are witnessing today?
So I wrote Apocalypse Never because I am an environmental activist. I've been an environmental activist for over 30 years. I've been a climate activist for over 20 years, but there's been so much alarmism and exaggeration that I felt the need to write a book that separates the science from the science fiction. I'm best known because I changed my mind about nuclear power about 10 years ago. I decided that we needed nuclear power in order to deal with climate change. So I very strongly feel that we need to address climate change. At the same time, I don't think it's appropriate to tell people that billions of people could die from climate change. That's not true. And it's created a lot of mental health problems, particularly among adolescents, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. And people need to know that actually we are addressing climate change, both from the transition from coal to natural gas and also in the transition to nuclear. So in terms of, what should we be worried about, which I think is your broader question, I point out in the book that climate change is real. It's not the end of the world. I don't think it's the most important environmental problem. The biggest environmental problem remains poverty, because if you don't have wealth and prosperity and economic growth, then we can't protect the natural environment. And so, one of the big environmental problems is just that there's so many people on Earth. We use a lot of food and energy. And so we do have negative environmental consequences on endangered species. That being said, we are not causing a sixth mass extinction. That's just not the case. A mass extinction is when you wipe out somewhere between 50 to 75% or more of all species on Earth. That's not happening, thank heavens. We should be concerned about our environmental impact, but a mass extinction is not something that's happening. And in fact, as people move to cities, as we use more concentrated forms of energy, the most concentrated, of course, is nuclear, then there's the chance to create more land for wildlife. Obviously, South Africa is a country that cares enormously about its wildlife, as well as the other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and has done an amazing job protecting wildlife areas. In order to do that, you need to have prosperity, which means you need cheap and reliable electricity, you need industrialization, and that provides the society with the wealth it needs to protect natural environments, to protect wildlife habitat, while also lifting your people out of poverty. So South Africa can be a developed economy where all of its citizens can enjoy a high energy, prosperous life.
That's very true what you say about South Africa. And we definitely want to preserve our wildlife. So would you say that it is absolutely extreme for someone to say that the planet is facing an immediate apocalypse situation? And why would somebody say that?
Yeah, I think it's an exaggeration. I think it's insensitive to the real apocalyptic, catastrophic problems that poor people face. You still have millions of South Africans, for example, that don't have reliable electricity, that don't have reliable water, indoor sanitation. Sub-Saharan Africa has huge challenges in terms of building the basic infrastructure. So for me to see rich people in Europe and the United States suggest that we all have to stop economic growth in order to address climate change, it's really counterproductive. I think it's very insensitive to the aspirations of the 2 billion people on Earth that still don't have their basic material comforts. At the same time, the good news is that we do have better ways of making electricity and providing food and energy than we had in the past. We have abundant natural gas, which produces 1/2 the carbon emissions of coal. And we have nuclear, which is our most special, most important source of energy. You know, the dream has always been for South Africa to build nuclear power plants that could then provide electricity for really much of sub-Saharan Africa, you know, going up to provide electricity to its neighbors. That dream is still a possibility. But I think it requires having a positive vision of the future where both people and the natural environment benefit from this extraordinary source of energy. If, you know, South Africa, you know, has incredible wildlife, Southern Africa has incredible wildlife. If you want to protect those areas, you can't build huge solar and wind farms, because solar and wind, industrial solar and wind projects, they take 300 to 400 times more land than nuclear power plants take. So in order to achieve these two goals of both lifting everybody out of poverty and protecting the natural environment, South Africa really needs to build out its nuclear power plants.
As you say, we definitely need to have a positive outlook, but I think it's really difficult in these times, especially with national lockdowns that we are experiencing. Almost every day there is news of forest fires, rising challenges around plastic waste, air pollution, and weather patterns changing our access to water resources. Michael, how are humans negatively affecting the planet's environment and, more importantly, the planet's ability to heal?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely climate change is happening. It's real. It's not the end of the world. We should do something about it, but we should not panic. Part of the reason I wrote Apocalypse Never is that I was bothered by Greta Thunberg saying to people, I don't want you to have hope, I want you to panic. I don't want my worst enemies to panic. I actually looked up the word panic in the dictionary to make sure I understood what it meant. You know, to panic means unthinking action. It means unthinking behavior. Well, that's very dangerous. We want to be thoughtful. We want to take strong action. We want to act decisively, but we don't want to panic. And so a lot of the challenges South Africa faces, it needs cheap energy, it needs reliable energy, it needs abundant electricity for all of its citizens. It needs to finish the project of building out modern infrastructure for all of its citizens so that they can be resilient to changing weather, to extreme weather events. You know, the good news is that natural disasters have gotten less severe actually over time as we've grown wealthier. So the number of people that are killed by natural disasters has declined by over 90% over the last 100 years. You know, it used to be that in places like South Asia, 100,000 people could die in a cyclone. You know, today just a small number of people die in hurricanes because we've done a really good job of protecting ourselves. And similarly, the difference between whether you can survive flooding is whether you have a flood management system, whether you have an infrastructure. So just think of the differences between the middle-class neighborhoods of Cape Town and the townships. Use the difference between having an infrastructure and not having an infrastructure. So if we are going to have a positive future in a world where there may be more extreme weather, all the more reason that we need to embrace a vision of shared development and prosperity. And that's only possible with cheap and reliable electricity.
And when you say a shared vision, are you talking globally?
Yeah, for the most part, decisions about food and energy are made by nations, not at the United Nations. I think there's a lot of people who want to try to control the food and energy decisions of other countries. People get some pretty grandiose ideas. There was always this idea that somehow it would all be coordinated through the United Nations. What South Africa does will be determined by South Africans, and what we do in the United States will be determined by Americans. It's fine for our diplomats to come together in New York City and have conversations and share ideas, but ultimately we're sovereign nations, and we need to make decisions for ourselves and what we want. And I think South Africa's at that decision point. Does South Africa want to mostly burn coal as its primary source of electricity, or does it want to use nuclear power? Obviously, there's some amount of natural gas, but if you really want to be a strong nation, an independent nation, a wealthy nation, and really a regional power, then South Africa will need to expand its nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is the most sophisticated energy technology. It's the most special technology. It obviously has multiple uses. So I think for South Africa to achieve its aspirations to be a great country and really a regional and continent-sized power in Africa, it's going to need to build out its nuclear power program.
You are an environmentalist and you've been an activist. This gives you some insight into why it seems that environmental groups tend to be evangelists of renewable energy. So given what you said earlier about wanting to preserve the environment and the best thing to do is not to develop wind turbines and solar panels, do you believe there is a problem with environmentalism? And how would you analyze that?
Well, this is a very important question, and it's a question I address in Apocalypse Never. So the first thing to remember is that for most of human history, we relied on renewable energy. So renewable energy includes wood, dung, water wheels, windmills, and that's what we use before we industrialize. So before the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which occurred in the late 1700s in Britain, and then the rest of Europe and the United States afterwards, we used renewables and we made the transition to fossil fuels. Everybody agrees that we could not have had the Industrial Revolution without fossil fuels. It required a concentrated source of energy to provide abundant and cheap and reliable energy that renewables couldn't provide. So what happened is that in the 1960s and 1970s, the political left, what we call progressives or the left, went from being pro-progress and in favor of development to a backlash against development. Now, this happened in wealthy countries, mostly in Europe and the United States, much less in developing countries, though you can certainly find it in wealthy neighborhoods in Rio de Janeiro, in Cape Town, I'm sure. There's an idea, it's a romantic idea, and the idea is that we'll all go back to this earlier form of living. It's for most people, it's not very well thought out. It's like you go to the grocery store and you see a product labeled all natural and you think it's better. So that's what renewables are for most people. But for other people, I'm afraid that there's a darker motivation for it. So the part of the renewables agenda is an extension of the colonial agenda, which is basically to keep countries poor or to make countries poor. Now, why would somebody want to do that? Well, and this particularly plays to Africa, and in my book, I wrote about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it's it was created by the Belgian, first by a Belgian corporation and then by the Belgian king. and a place of terrible tragedy and exploitation, like much of the developing world. And the idea was, let's leave these African countries poor to be able to avoid industrialization so we can protect the natural environment. That was the idea. And so we want to kind of, and it continues, where you sort of say, well, they're going to always be poor, but we can give them a solar panel, or a little bit of energy, enough for a little bit of light. But we know that renewables aren't going to be sufficient, at least solar and wind are not going to be sufficient to power industrialization. Now, there is one source of renewable energy that can have that, which is hydroelectric dams, the really big dams. And so, one of the biggest dams that could ever be created in the world would be a dam system on the Congo River in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So there's really two possibilities, as far as I can tell, for how sub-Saharan Africa achieves high energy, high electricity. The first is that South Africa builds a lot of nuclear power plants, which would be my first preference. And then South Africa can sell that electricity to its neighbors going north. Another possibility is that the Democratic Republic of the Congo builds the Grand Inga Dam, which are huge dams on the Congo River, and then is able to sell electricity to South Africa and to its neighbors. Or you might have a little bit of both. But there's opposition, unfortunately, from some environmentalists in Europe, in the United States, both to nuclear and to large hydroelectric dams. And the opposition is actually to industrialization. And it's a fear that Africa will no longer be a place of nature, wildlife, and that it will become like Europe, which doesn't have the wild nature that sub-Saharan Africa has. Now, in my book, I argue that this is a mistake, and that, in fact, the biggest threat to wildlife is from poverty. It's poor people trying to survive. And so the demand for ivory, which came from China, resulted in people ending up killing a lot of elephants in sub-Saharan Africa. And we similarly see in Virunga Park in the Congo, which is one of the most famous wildlife parks in the world, spectacular. It's where the mountain gorillas are. It's very romantic, very beautiful. The threat to the park does not come from industrialization. It comes from very poor people trying to survive and farming inside the park, and also making charcoal from wood inside the park. So my argument is that the opposition to industrialization and the advocacy of renewables comes from a bad place, in the sense of it comes from a colonial agenda, but it's also just mistaken. And that if you want to protect the natural wildlife, people need to be able to live in the cities and benefit from industrialization, so that countries have the wealth they need. When you become wealthy, you have the resources that you need in order to protect wildlife, because it turns out that protecting wildlife and having wildlife parks is very expensive.
Michael, your book idea originally started out to address nuclear power, but expanded into other areas. And I can see how that came about in terms of your passion for the environment and really to uplift communities. So for my next question is whether the power and energy industry playing a key role in mitigating climate change.
Sure. So, I think the way to think about energy and the environment is as a series of energy transitions, and that the transitions from lower forms of energy to higher forms of energy is a form of both human progress and environmental progress. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're using wood as your primary source of energy, then anything is better, including coal. So it's better to burn coal than wood. But if you're using coal, it's better to burn petroleum or natural gas. And then if you're using petroleum or natural gas, it's better to use uranium, which of course is fissioned rather than burned to release energy. So this is also a progress of higher energy densities. So if I hold a lump of wood in my hand and a lump of coal, a lump of wood can cook a pot of beans. For a small farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, can cook a pot of beans for a couple of hours. That's it. A lump of coal has twice as much energy and it could heat your house. But a lump of uranium, or about a Coke can of uranium, can provide me with all the power I need for my entire life. And so energy density, the amount of energy from a quantity of fuel, is the thing that determines environmental impact. It also is a measure of our sophistication. It's harder to burn coal than wood. It requires more infrastructure. It's harder to create the infrastructure and use natural gas than coal. And uranium is the most challenging. It's the most technologically sophisticated. And that's part of the reason it's so important for countries like South Africa to be developing nuclear, because the more nuclear you have, the more sophisticated, the more developed you are as a nation. But that being said, in my book, I defend the right of poor countries, India, for example, Pakistan, but also sub-Saharan Africa, to use coal because coal is better than wood. But if you can go right from wood to uranium, which is what South Africa is considering doing, that's even better, because then you can just leap over the dirtier fossil fuels. But I think that's the right way to think about it. And also, when I say energy density, the fuel in the case of solar and wind is the sunlight and wind. And so the reason it takes 300 to 400 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity from an industrial solar farm or an industrial wind farm as it does from either a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant is energy density. Sunlight and wind, they're very energy dilute. It's why you can sit in the sun and you'll be okay. But uranium, when it's hot, is emitting so much energy. That's why it has so much energy density. That's why it's the best way to make energy. So I think of it that way, is that you really need to think about energy density, or another concept is power density, which is just how much electricity you can produce on a given amount of land.
And what is the role of nuclear energy in mitigating climate change?
Yeah, I mean, so really the only technology that can significantly reduce our carbon emissions is nuclear power. In fact, only nuclear can reduce humankind's overall footprint. It's pretty amazing if you think about it. So we do, there's some trends that are going in the right direction. All else being equal, we should want to have temperatures rise less than more, but obviously not all else is equal. People need energy. So there's going to be some amount of climate change. There already has been about 1 degree temperature increase since the Industrial Revolution. We would rather have 2 degrees of warming than 3, or 3 degrees of warming than 4. So we should make an effort to reduce carbon emissions. But we also need to support development. People want prosperity. We need progress. We need cheap electricity. And so for that reason, only nuclear can achieve the 2 objectives, which we should always have at the same time, which is to lift people out of poverty and protect the natural environment. So only nuclear can replace fossil fuels. Solar panels and wind turbines cannot replace fossil fuels, and the reason is because they're unreliable. They only produce electricity when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, and that means that you always have to have other forms of energy backing them up. You always have to have a natural gas power plant or some other form of energy backing it up. So you can never replace your fossil fuel infrastructure. In fact, if you build solar and wind projects, it's always on top of what you already have. And that's part of the reason that solar and wind make electricity so expensive, and part of the reason that nuclear energy is so game-changing. If you look at a country like France, it's able to get 75 or more % of its electricity from nuclear, whereas Germany has basically reached the maximum of renewables it can generate, around 35% of its electricity. Beyond that, it's in danger of destroying its electricity grid, making electricity prices too high, and becoming too dependent on imported natural gas from Russia.
We still have a few more minutes, and I still want to delve deeper into this topic. But recently, the Korean government changed its plans to scrap nuclear power from its energy mix. Michael, what do you believe was the persuading factor that led to this, that other governments can learn from?
Well, right. So South Korea is a country I care a lot about. I've spent a lot of time there. They have a lot of fear of nuclear in South Korea. And I think it has to do both with the Fukushima accident in 2011, but I think it also has to do with fears of a nuclear conflict with North Korea. So South Korea is a bit of an outlier country in some ways. It did decide in 2017 to continue construction of 2 new nuclear reactors that are wonderful, huge reactors, but then agreed to continue with a reduction in overall nuclear. So it's a bit of a mixed story in South Korea. But what I will say is that the big lesson from South Korea is that the best nuclear is nuclear that we have a lot of experience building, operating, and regulating. And so, understandably, nuclear engineers sometimes are very enthusiastic about experimenting with different nuclear designs. And while I favor innovation and research and development, what South Korea teaches us is that it's better to go with the tried and true nuclear power reactors. And so I think one of the implications for South Africa would be to work with a construction company with some country that has a lot of experience building nuclear power, because the more experience you have, the safer, the faster, and cheaper it's going to be to build those new reactors.
That's very good advice in terms of going with the tried and tested reactors that are out there. But that will still never stop innovation from happening. Research and development is something that is ingrained in our human psyche. However, in terms of our feelings, there is an understandable fear around nuclear power. What is your message to ordinary people on what nuclear energy represents?
I mean, nuclear energy is just a radical technology, and I think we're just still, even though it's been around for 75 years, we're still coming to grips with what it means. And so understandably, there have been a lot of people that have just been overwhelmed by it. The first use of nuclear energy, the main use of nuclear energy, of course, has been to make nuclear weapons. That was how nuclear energy was invented. And that's been very scary for people, and understandably so. They're very powerful weapons. And so there's been a desire among some people to try to get rid of nuclear energy. And it's not rational, but there's been this idea that if we could get rid of nuclear power plants, that somehow we might get rid of nuclear weapons. That's kind of obviously wrong. In fact, we've known for 75 years that for a variety of reasons, we can't just get rid of nuclear weapons. People have tried, but instead, in fact, nuclear weapons gradually spread around the world. In some situations, South Africa is a little different in this. South Africa gave up its nuclear weapons But nonetheless, nuclear power and the ability to split the atom is something that we're not going to be able to forget or get rid of. In fact, the ability to split atoms to make heat, which is fission, atomic fission, that came right out of science. That came right out of what happens in the laboratory. And so there's no way to get rid of it. So what I would say is we're still coming to grips with the fact that we have a responsibility, we have this incredible power, and we have a responsibility to use that power wisely and to our benefit. And so what I would say is that the power of nuclear is so shocking that you could create so much heat without fire. It's still so shocking to people that it's almost a spiritual evolution, or to sound a little California here, it's a bit of an evolution of consciousness that's required. But the good news is that, we're pretty good at dealing with dangerous things. I mean, obviously, things go wrong. We saw in Beirut, they had an explosion in Beirut, Lebanon a few months ago. It was filmed. It was a very dramatic explosion, and that was with conventional artillery that they stored badly. So we have accidents. The worst energy accident of all time was the collapse of a dam in China, of a hydroelectric dam in China that killed 150,000 people. But the fact of the matter is we actually are getting better and better at dealing with dangerous things. We just become more sophisticated, more aware. And so really, if you look at the accidents that we've had with nuclear, they are overwhelmingly in the past. And Fukushima, even though people think it was a serious accident, it actually didn't kill anybody, which is pretty amazing. The tsunami killed 15,000 people. A natural disaster killed 15,000 people, but nobody died from the radiation from Fukushima. So what I always point out is that, when we started, when the era of jet travel began after World War II in the 1950s, and you look at a graph, you see the miles traveled since the 1950s just goes up and up and up and up, and now we fly all the time, or we did before COVID, and hopefully will again soon. But the number of accidents and the number of deaths from jet plane crashes has gone down. So you've had these two things happening at the same time, and it looks exactly the same for nuclear. That we've much more experience operating nuclear plants. The graph goes up and up and up, but the number of accidents and problems has gone down. And I think that's a testament to human ingenuity, the fact that we are such intelligent, such conscious species of animal. And I think that's why I have so much optimism for the future. I always joke that, what Churchill said about the United States, I think you could say about the entire human race when it comes to nuclear, which is, humans will really start to use nuclear much more after we've exhausted every other option. I think we have to fail with solar and wind and see why we can't power our economies on solar and wind before we truly start to use nuclear power in earnest.
Lastly, Michael, what is your hope for the future of the planet in general?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. I mean, I think we are in an age where we're clearly moving away from wanting to be divided around race, around ethnicity, around nations. We want to have a common goal. And I think we are close to having that. For many years, there's been a commitment to lifting all people out of poverty. And we've lifted, there's about, 7.5 billion people in the world. There's still about 2 billion that live in poverty. We've also committed ourselves to protecting the natural environment. So for me, what gives me hope is that I think most people want to achieve an end to poverty and greater protection of the natural environment. And I think that's what brings us together. And really all that's required is that we understand that the key to that is large amounts of clean, abundant energy. And only nuclear energy can provide that. So nuclear energy has a transcendent moral purpose, which is to lift everybody out of poverty while reducing our negative environmental impact. And I think that few people realize that. I think even the nuclear industry has been slow to talk about that, in part because what we call the nuclear industry is often involved in other forms of energy. But the fact of the matter is that only nuclear can achieve the world that most people say they want, which is a world of cheap, abundant, clean energy that can end poverty and also protect the natural environment.
That's all we have time for today. Michael Shellenberger, on behalf of NIASA and ESI Africa, thank you so much for speaking with us and sharing your insights. To our viewers, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to keep up to date with the latest industry developments on the ESI Africa website. Goodbye and stay safe.